You're listening to Funk with Fate, a show about being a body and cultivating pleasurable relationships with everything. And I'm your host, Mackenzie McCormick. This podcast will explore how our embodied experiences connect us to the world through astrology, philosophy, dance, magic, and anything that invigorates our aliveness. What makes us feel the most alive? Big inhale, big exhale. Now let's get grooving. Hello, Hadi, and welcome to the show. Right now, it is just a couple minutes before 5 p.m. on Friday, March 24th, 2023. And right now, we have the final couple degrees of Leo rising. So today we are exploring the Spicy Rendezvous, which is the first of a series on the podcast going into Mars, meeting up with Mars, saying hello to Mars, understanding Mars in a more embodied way. And this is the first of this series. And today we have Shahir on the show.
Hi, everyone.
I'm so excited that Shahir is here. If you are watching the video version, you are seeing both of us smile so big right now because this is amazing and I'm so happy about this. So Shahir, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, about who you are, your practice, and yeah, anything that you wish to share.
Yeah, I am Shahir, they, them pronouns. I am a love devotee. I always call myself that. I'm a queer, Muslim, brown, Southeast Asian mystic who believes in love and love in everything. And obviously, I am also a practicing astrologer, practicing tarot reader, and a spirit guide bridger. So yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here. And as I guess it would suggest, you have Mars in Cancer. Are you comfortable sharing your chart with us?
Yeah, of course. I am Mars in Cancer, quite hidden. So it's like this is a bit more vulnerable moment, I guess. I don't like to talk about Mars actually, which is kind of interesting to me. I have a Sag rising and my Mars by whatever system inherently because of the degree it's in the eighth house of death and fear, etc. But my Mars is interesting because actually it's in the duat of Capricorn as well, actually. And so it's like it has that kind of like whatever duat situation, but it also has like I think like Antisha, like contra Antisha to my not like nodes in a way, although it's like a few degrees off. But like I do feel the Mars nodal kind of like energy sometimes as well. So yeah, so I'm an Aries sun, Gemini moon, Sag rising. So my Mars rules like those 12 and the fifth house. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing. Also, before we go any further, I want to go ahead and say a bit of a trigger warning about Mars because Mars is traditionally considered a malefic. It does sometimes touch sensitive material and topics, potentially including but not limited to things like aggression, anger, any inflammation or injury, illness in the body, things like that. And so to just take care of yourself moving forward as we potentially talk about any one or of these things in relation to Mars. So your Mars is in Cancer, and Mars in Cancer is ruled by the moon. And so this place, Mars traditionally doesn't love to be. This is seen, Mars in fall, essentially. And it's doesn't mean that it's weak, though. I feel that something that can often be misconstrued with debilitated Mars in any way is thinking that that makes them not as strong as another Mars. And so I guess, well, we know that your Mars is in the eighth house, and so that's like a bit of a vulnerable thing. And I'm very grateful that you agreed to come on and talk about it. Me, especially knowing it's in a dark house and knowing that dark house life.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it is. It is. So for me, like having Mars Cancer in a way, it is kind of difficult. And I think it's like for me, I always go back to like kind of just like what's the word of it? The Mars is in a place where there's a lot of emotions in a way. Like I always feel that way in a way. Um, and so whenever I feel into like a Mars in Cancer, it's like the topic of like Martian things or even like fighting for something especially for myself or having control of my own personal emotions sometimes can feel very difficult. And like I always see like Cancer as like the sign that kind of like feel a lot of things. This was like the cardinal water, right? And so there's this sense of like I'm moving from one thing to another with my emotions. And also the moon also moves a lot, right? As a very cardinal sign. But then Mars doesn't want to lead by emotions necessarily, because that can kind of like trigger a sense of like violence, or a sense of like, this kind of like tendency to control in some ways as well. And so I think that's like the more quote unquote difficult part of Mars. And I can see how like it's being related to like a fallen Mars. And I was also like, I like to think of like I like to delineate Mars through the lens of like, all right, if it's like through the lens of Aries, especially because I have a like an Aries fifth house, right? And Mars is in the fourth place of Aries, or the fourth place of where it resides, which is right now is in Cancer in my eighth house. And so like there is a lot of experience sometimes also like when it comes to like love and pleasure, that when emotions are involved and all those things, it can feel very dominating in a way. Like it feels like it's as if like, eighth house can also um feel that it's almost like there is almost a this push and pull of like dominance or power when it comes to with another person. And so that's like kind of like the most literal expression of like Mars in the eighth house in Cancer. For me, that feels very alive. Yeah.
Yeah, especially that what you were speaking to about the way that you feel with emotions, and
Mm-hmm.
almost almost seeming that Mars and Cancer would have this reaction to get potentially upset about feeling those emotions and
Mm-hmm.
not wanting to be that vulnerable or that emotional in that way, not wanting to another person to see them with their guard down.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that's very fair. And sometimes vulnerability, like, Cancer is like kind of like a sign. I mean, obviously Cancer also has shells, but like it can also feel like it's like any sort of emotions can also feel like, oh, is it like it's triggered. And so like every single emotion can like trigger you a lot. Like be it like, it doesn't just be about anger necessarily. Sometimes like sadness or like people's projection, like people's any sort of like when someone says something and then sometimes you can feel like like that sort of like fight or flight. I think that's very Mars in Cancer kind of feeling, like the feeling of like wanting to react whenever um when in fact sometimes is like I also feel that there's nothing there's no threat, but then I think Mars in Cancer can create a threat out of nothing, and I think that's the danger of it. um in one on some sense. So yeah, that's part of it. Yeah.
Oh, yes, because that moon rulership really emphasizes that fight or flight response, that
Mm-hmm.
survival instinct, which is something that, people wouldn't think that the moon and the Mars have things in common per se because they are each other's fall. But at the
Mm-hmm.
same time, there is something so vulnerably incarnate that they both deal with on a level of survival, and the way that they make themselves be able to stay and sustain in the world, that they both have a bit of that really cardinal energy. As you were saying, they are going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's that fallen aspect of almost not wanting to do it or not being sure if doing it is right.
Yeah, yeah, because you think that like because you're being led by some sort of like this like emotional force and something like that too, right? And I think it's it's kind of like obvious. Like I do see Mars as um a force that we want to control in our lives. And that's why, that's why Mars is the power of like exerting force, right? It's like whether it be good or bad, and usually sometimes I mean people associate malefic with something quite bad, but like, Mars wants to do something, right? But then in Cancer, it's like it feels like there's this sense of like, oh my God, like I can't do everything that I am emotionally attached to, right? That's kind of like illogical in some way, like, and feelings are illogical and irrational. And then I do feel like sometimes having Mars in Cancer can tend towards this feeling of that, like, oh my God, like, just like, oh, like, that sort of like stuck of like, oh, whether I should be doing something from that point of like emotions or just like reacting to it. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's yes. Yes. I actually just realized that we
Uh-huh.
did a very, very cardinal thing and did not even talk about why this series or even how this series came into being.
Oh my God.
So we'll back up just a second.
You can also edit them. Yeah. I mean,
No, we're not editing, baby. We're being authentic on this one.
okay.
And that's very authentic and very cardinal, and that's how it went. And I even told you before we got on about how much I really feel like I needed this because my start to Aries season was funky, and I was like, I need Shahir's vibrant Aries energy.
Yeah.
But also super worth mentioning how that Shahir is on being the first of my series, in many ways honoring that I was the first person that was on Shahir's Venus series.
Yes.
Shout out to Shahir for doing this gorgeous Venus embodiment series, which everybody should go and listen to and watch if you haven't yet. They're amazing. And this is the first in my series. For me, I wanted to start specifically with Mars in Cancer, not just because of you, but also because we have had the longest Mars in Gemini. It feels like it's gone on for centuries.
Yeah.
That Mars has been in Gemini. And I was like, I don't want to start with this experience that we're all really ready to get sick of. Like in a year and some change or two, like whenever we get there again, it'll feel much nicer after the last retrograde cycle. So that was one of the big So that was one of the big reasons I wanted to start with Mars in Cancer. Also because I personally have a soft spot for this placement and all debilitated Mars. If you're watching the video version, you can see that I'm wearing a top with bright red roses on it. I am extremely Mars. Mars and I have a fantastic relationship. And that is one of the reasons that I wanted to do this series on this planet, because it is a malefic. And as you just said, Shahir, people often think, okay, malefic, that means bad. That means bad. And yes, but also no. There are challenges that come with malefics that benefics will never give you. And there are lessons that you will get from malefics that you'll never get from a benefic. And just as the same way, vice versa. And that's the beauty of duality and a spectrum and learning things from different points of view. And Mars in particular, especially because I'm a very Mars person, I also have a debilitated Mars. So that is one of the reasons I love other debilitated Mars so much. Just every single one of you. Chef's kiss. And yeah, this planet, this placement, it means a lot to me. And I'm really excited to be diving into it further. Specifically starting with you because we have talked about Mars quite a bit, because both of our Mars are in dark houses. They're both debilitated. We're both night chart babies. And so we have just a lot of kinship in that, being also part of the Sag rising family. So yeah. Okay. Now let's keep rocking and rolling.
All right.
So you've already talked like a bit about obviously like where your natal Mars is and a bit of your relationship to it. Do you want to talk at all about the ruler of your Mars? Because your Mars is ruled by the moon. Do you want to talk about her? Because I love her.
Yeah. And so my Mars, that's also like another lost feeling of my Mars, I feel. Because like the ruler of my Mars is the moon, and the moon for me is in Gemini. So it's like there is some sort of like way that I do feel that I think the way that works, at least in my chart, at least like having Gemini in the 7th house, is like I think that's where I feel the Mars kind of like loud in a good way as well. Like for me, it feels so easy. Like if I have a sense of like connection with you, like I'll kind of like, that's very typical Mars in Cancer, like feeling very protective of the people they love in some way. And sometimes it can also feel like a lot because like the moon likes to contain, right? The moon likes, so I'm gonna include everyone in some way, or wants to care for the people that they love. And yeah, I have Gemini moon ruling my Mars in Cancer, so that's in the seventh house. Um, and that comes from any single one-on-one relationships I am in, um um that like feels very much alive. And I do love to, like, it's like when I once I consider someone like as a friend, or like a lover, or like, my family in some ways, like I can easily always just like advocate for them. Which is kind of interesting because like Mars and Cancer kind of like learning how, but then there'll be kind of like problems when it comes to my own emotions, because the Mars and the moon can't see each other. So it's like I do feel like my Mars is a bit lost sometimes. I'm like, like, it's just like because planets doesn't see the ruler. So my Mars is kind of on its own. And fun fact, my Mars is also out of bounds. And so that's like another added layer of, for me, is like she's wild. Like, she like he does whatever he wants, and kind of like there are moments that I'll be surprised at my own things as well, especially with regards to like my own fear and like the hidden things in life that I equate with. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Mars and fear is a big one because there's so much of that initial like urge that comes forth when any sort of situation that gets you triggered comes up, and then lots of like jump reactions potentially, and then having to really process those emotions. And especially with like a Mercury ruled moon, especially for you, like thinking through those feelings and all of those
Mm-hmm.
layers of processing,
Yeah.
that really helps you inform like, okay, what do I actually want to do?
Yeah.
The specifically, I'm also just really biased because your moon is like right next to my sun, and so I'm super biased with how much I love it. But it's always felt very much that easiness, like that
Mm-hmm.
comfortability that is an entryway into
Mm-hmm.
like getting close.
Yeah.
um that really takes trust to know that you can put your walls down in that way and let
Mm.
someone in.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. And yeah, and I think it's like I love how you're talking about like the processing of the Mercury, because I think my Mercury talks to my Mars a lot. My Mars is in the term Lord of Mercury. And so I do like, I do write on Substack, and people always say that like, oh wow, like you can really feel like the emotions of your words, when in fact, like, like the depth of it, and like how like it's always like very impactful in a way. And I think there's also a sense of that, like Mars wanting to create that sort of like impact in a way, like because it wants to kind of like exert some sort of a force, right? And yeah, my Mercury in Pisces has that beautiful trine with Mars, which I really love.
Mm.
So yeah, props to them working together. Yeah.
That is
Yeah.
like a gorgeous water trine. It really is.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is truly so supportive, which is honestly speaks to the way that planets, even if considered debilitated, when they're making supportive aspects, when they're able to have these like really supportive lines of sight, these flowing resources between each other, they're able to do better no matter
Mm-hmm.
what, even if they're in a state that would be considered, not their ideal. They still have avenues of support and ways to be seen.
Yeah,
um
yeah. And using, I think it's also like I do use words a lot to affirm myself of my fear. And so that's kind of like a very literal manifestation of like, yeah, like I do have a Mars ruling my 12th house, our Scorpio 12th house. And that can feel very much like trying to confront that fear and using my own words to kind of like affirm myself of like certain emotions. That feels very much like those things, like Mercury, Mars working together. And yeah, and it's also water sign. Like water sign is also like sometimes they don't speak, right? They're just vibing, and like trying to feel into what the words which are like at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. So you were talking about your Scorpio house.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about your Scorpio and your Aries houses, because those are the two signs that Mars rules. And so
Mm-hmm.
you're a Sag rising. And so your Scorpio house is the 12th and your Aries house is the 5th. Um, and you have planets in both of them, which is exciting.
Mm-hmm.
How do I guess the planets in your Mars ruled houses relate to your Mars themselves? How does Mars rule them? What does Mars have to say to them or provide them?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. It's having have Pluto in the 12th house, right? And that's like intense in a way. I'm never like I hate like no, I don't hate Pluto, but like Pluto always demands some sort of like a rebirth and death process in terms of my spirituality, or like 12th house is like, my personal undoing is in a way like I think it's just like my own inner saboteur, and I see that very loudly. And having a fallen Mars as the ruler, it's kind of like um I do feel very like emotionally attached to like certain moments of like crisis of like spirituality almost sometimes, right? And the Mars is like not wanting to believe like um certain things. And I was like thinking of like part of the reason why Mars is also falling in Cancer. It's also because Cancer is also a sign that's related to divinity in some way. Because it's like the exaltation of Jupiter, right? It's like um I was reading something, because Mars is also like classically associated with like domination and like victorious. And sometimes when we try to dominate something, we think we're God, right? And I think sometimes like that could be, I do feel like that Mars ruling that 12th house is like there is some sort of like reckoning with the idea of divinity or God that can sometimes feel that like, oh, like I'm losing, or like I'm not winning or something like that, or like it feels like I am being abandoned or something like that kind of dynamic, which is kind of loud sometimes to be honest. And recently like, and I very much feel the energy of like I always have to go through this process of like death and rebirth. And I think it really is important for me to kind of like feel that I am alive with that Mars, like whenever I am overcoming my own doubts in a way. And so I was thinking about that because I was thinking about like the fallen Mars through the context of like Jupiter, and why Jupiter is exalted there, and like kind of like the belief in kind of like this bigger sort of things. And sometimes Mars can feel like it's the violent one, right? It's like it's trying to like break away from something or trying to be unfaithful or something. And so that's kind of like a topic that I kind of like struggle with in terms of the Scorpio house. In terms of the Aries house, it's it's more like
Oh
I
my
think.
gosh. Oh my
Mhm.
gosh. I have
Go
to
ahead.
say something though, really
What's up?
quick
Go ahead.
before you go on to
Yeah.
your Aries house. That made me think a lot about the relationship between Mars and Jupiter in Cancer, specifically in that moon ruled place. Made
Hmm.
me think a lot about that. What you were saying, the difference between having to get past your own fears to do something while also sort of this death of the ego in a way,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
almost that like that very martial like domination, and also just that must be that need to be the superior in a
Yeah.
way, like besting someone,
Yeah.
and almost this god complex that people have, that they must be the like martyr in a
Yeah.
situation,
Yeah.
and moving past that to then like finding them where it actually meets what you really want for yourself or expect for yourself versus what you think you are supposed to do or should want in a
Hmm.
situation.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly part of it. Yeah, because it's like Mars. I think I remember Dr. Olumi's like podcast thing. I was talking about like how if Jupiter is a planet of oath, and then like Mars is the one that the breaker of the oath, right? And so there is a sense of like the struggle with kind of just like, oh, I'm trying to dominate something, I'm trying to like, oh, overcome something, but then in the process, what is it I'm truly doing with myself? And it's like, that ego death kind of story feels very alive usually for me. Yeah. Yeah. um so where do we go now? The
Oh, you were
Aries
talking,
house.
yeah.
Yeah, the Aries house. For me, like, yeah, I do have my heart is very interesting, to be honest. In a way, I do feel that my I do feel that my Aries house is kind of like sometimes ignores Mars. And then that is why that is why I feel that sometimes my Aries house is kind of like, because I have an Aries sun, and I think I've gotten a few readings from even different astrologers, how um kind of like, because my sun is very exalted, right? It's like it is exalted. There's like, um and so it is also an overcoming sort of like exaltation to the Mars. And so there is this sense that topics of the fifth house sometimes overtaken by the sun just because of my dignity, right? um Although the sun can also be malefic, so that's also like another issue that I have. But then, that's another period or a story. But um it feels that sometimes I operate my fifth house solely to the sun. And so like because I have like Venus kind of like, the sun absorbs the quality of Venus as well, like fucking burn the Venus and like include it together, right? And so like Venus rejoicing but also detriment. And so I do feel that sometimes fifth house are not necessarily related to the eighth. However, I've also had this, I've had, like, if I were talking about lovers, and I think this could be a more sensitive eighth house things, I have experienced some sort of like, romantic sort of like relationships where things are hidden, like where, obviously I think I obviously sometimes I equate that of like being queer in the past, etc., and like, oh, like I can't be like out with you in a way, like, although I'm out. And so that was, I feel like that is part of like the fifth house ruler in the eighth kind of experience, where I feel that like, oh, my lover kind of like hides me, or like, like there is a sense of like, oh, it's being hidden in the eighth, right? It's like it's not being out there. And then there also has been instances where, this is where the not so great Mars kind of like comes out, where it kind of like brings up, domination in other people, when in fact, and sometimes it's also like a projection thing, I feel. And which is kind of like a complex I have. Like, I've had met people which is like they can feel very dominating whenever like we're partners in a way, or like, or sometimes even though they're not dominating towards me, I can feel as if I am being dominated by them. Like, it's kind of like this feeling of like powerlessness of that Mars, of like, oh shit, like, it's like, why is other person like determining my agency, and so there is that sort of like dynamic, kind of, um that theme of like Mars as domination, that kind could come up as a expression of the ruler of like the fifth house. And yeah, so that's also part of it. Yeah, it can also be fun, it can also be fun whenever you're using, like, you're utilizing in certain kind of like, spicy, like, intimate, playful, and consensual. I think, like, like in consensual like sex and settings, those are great, but then, you know not everyone can be trusted with that, right? And so that's also another thing, you know.
That was such a Mars and Cancer statement. The way you ended that, you're like, not everyone can be trusted with that. We don't open the cards to everybody. No.
Yeah.
It is interesting what you said though about specifically how your Aries house, even being Mars ruled, almost becomes more attributed to the sun. Because just being your friend, this is something that I have also like experienced in you, because you're so exalted sun, baby. Like you are, with that rejoicing Venus. It is so loud that Mars, even like, especially being in a dark house, would almost just like prefer to be like, yeah, I'll be on the sidelines, y'all,
Yeah.
don't worry about me back here, minding my business until somebody steps out of line.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I think yeah, somebody else, and then I'll be like, I think the Mars could come up very lethal in a way. And I think it's like, the Mars can also be, there is a sense of like, people also sometimes equate Mars in Cancer with like a sense of like passive aggressiveness, right? And that's kind of like a behavior that's I kind of like have to, like, I think I'm adult enough to be self-aware of it whenever I'm doing it. And whenever I'm doing it, I know there's something wrong, which I'm not being truthful about. And then that's also comes in with like, I'm probably not being truthful about my emotions. And that's kind of like a simple kind of like Cancerian kind of like moon relation kind of like thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, it's the sweet moon. Oh goodness. The sweet Mars, honestly, so uncomfortable, but
Yeah.
that is the thing about Mars, as out of all the planets, when they're debilitated, especially Mars, like not just debilitated, but in fall, there is something about the way that Mars is able to make shit happen
Mm-hmm.
despite all odds. There's a sense of, I must be able to get past this, and no
Mm-hmm.
matter what it takes, even if it ends up with those sort of feelings of like, all right, well, I have to confront that I maybe was trying to survive and I wasn't paying attention to my emotions in that moment, and I was
Mm-hmm.
overlooking them, and now I'm going to need to go back and address those, and
Mm-hmm.
how that then can really develop into a much more keen awareness of your emotional well-being, of how willing you are to be vulnerable, about what it takes for you to be vulnerable,
Yeah.
all of the steps that it requires and everything that you must feel for that to happen.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to like I do note that like I was reading Austin Cobb's like delineation of like the Mars and all the decans there, and generally it's like everything is not good, right? And then that's pretty much true too. Like that, like sometimes I do feel like Mars and Cancer people do experience some sort of like um sorry strife in terms of like familial stuff, and that has to do with like the Aries house too, like because like from the perspective of like Aries, right? Aries is um if it's Aries rising, for instance, the Mars will be in the fourth place, right? And Mars doesn't want to create that sort of strife in the home. Like, it's like the one that kind of just like waged war with your own kin, kind of like the idea.
Mm.
And maybe it's also like your own kin waging war against you. Um, and there has been some sort of like bad sort of experience in my life where some of like my biggest wounding in life has been the people that are closest to me, and like has been like I remember I was like feeling very hurt by like a certain family member, etc. And so I do feel like Mars and Cancer sometimes, and that's also where I think they also like a sense of like the keen awareness of like your own vulnerability comes from, because there is this sense that like there is a sense of like, all right, like I care for these people, but they end up like hurting me the most, right? And so how much like what I think there's also like a sense of like, how much am I giving to this kind of like power, how much power am I giving to the situation as actually as well. And so but then it can also be the fierce protector, so it's kind of like that. In a way it can also comes into like that mother martyrdom sort of like pettiness in a way too, like it's just like, I loved you and you betrayed me, and kind of just like a very classic story in a way. But then yeah, that can also be a thing,
it it seems like the betrayal of any type feels
Mm-hmm.
so much deeper when
Mm-hmm.
it's with people who are closer to you, especially because you have already gone to such great lengths to let them in to be that close to you to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
It really seems that Mars and Cancer people don't quite understand how much it takes for you to let them, like, to be close. And
Yeah.
so then whenever anything goes wrong or any issue comes up, um, that it seems so much worse because they don't quite appreciate how much it took for them to even get that close to you in the first place.
Yeah, no, I think that's very fair. That's definitely one of it. Yeah. Yeah. It's like the moon is like the mooning,
For sure. So, I guess you kind of talked about it a little bit. I wanted to ask about planets that Mars is like making aspects with. And we've
Hmm.
kind of been talking about it, about that amazing trine to your Mercury.
Yeah,
And then
I
this,
kind of have another one to talk about, like the trying to Mercury too. Um, I think it's like because it's in the eighth house, which is I call the eighth house as kind of like the inherited things. And one thing I'm actually very intimate with Mars in the eighth house is actually like I tell these people sometimes it kind of makes me crazy, or like whatever word people equate it, because it's like um it is like when I was younger, I'm very intimate with the concept of death. It's kind of weird, and I think that has been I think it's also like eighth house is kind of like ancestral, or the whether like sometimes people also equate eighth house to kind of like the baggage, right? It's kind of like things you inherited, which you're perhaps not fully conscious of. And I think and then with the Mercury in the fourth of hidden things, I do work with my ancestors a lot, or like the spirits, and I do feel that that's also where I love advoc like almost like having some sort of like advocacy in the spirit realm. That's part of my job in a way. And that's what I do in a session as well, especially with regards to like more sensitive or more spirit, like unseen realm sort of sessions I do. Um, and that can makes like I feel very connected to kind of like the unseen world, and I feel that has a lot to do with that Mars being ruling the 12, and then talking to that Mercury in this in the fourth. And so that's like part of the ease, to be honest. And then one of my favorite angels is actually Angel of Death. I always call upon like my Angel of Death in kind of like moments of crisis, or kind of like um because, and the reason why I kind of have that sort of like intimacy is also because I like I had moments in life where I kind of knew when all my grandparents passed away. I mean, obviously they passed away during different times. I got a prophecy or some sort of like revelations even before that happened. And so that's why I'm kind of like intimate with like quote unquote the death angel, whatever, although that can sound scary to some people. But then um the archetype of death has always been very much alive since I was like I think 8 or something like that. Because I knew I always knew from very young there's this some sort of like a weird knowing of like when someone in my family is going to pass away and to die, going to die. And it's a scary feeling. I mean, even saying it here feels like, ouch, like wow. Um, and but then I have that sort of like dynamic with it, intuitive sort of like dynamic with that trine. Yeah.
That's so special. The fourth, eighth, 12th trine is really the most sensitive of them all. Whatever modality you have there, like whether you have planets there or not, they're super sensitive. And you have, like 3 planets and like one in each. So
Yeah.
the connection is super real.
Yeah.
When you were talking about the angel of death, it really like struck me. It was like, wow, that is such an embodiment of a Mars in Cancer, like especially in the 8th house, but just that is so deeply like rooted in that experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And also like the familial experience of it too. Like for instance, like when my first grandpa passed away, um, I knew that day I didn't go to school. I told my mom, I was like, we're not going to like, because usually we have like morning and evening school. And I was like, I'm not going to the evening school. Like, I just feel something weird is going to happen. And then my like grandpa passed away. And then like when I was in college, like I knew that week was like, I had that like, I think in Islamic cosmology, there was this kind of like idea that when you, when someone passed away, like the idea is like there's this divine tree, right? And then their names will be written in a way, and then the name written will be given to like the death angel, like Israel. And then you will know who will like kind of like be dead next in a way. And then that's like fuck. I remember vividly, I was like dreaming, I had the dream of like, oh, like this tree was dropping, and I was like, I kind of knew like, all right, I think someone in my kind of like someone I close with going to pass away, you know. And then one of my closest ancestors, which is like my grandma Che, um, is also like that one is like a super cathartic, elaborate, divine dream where it was very close. And and then I told my mom, and literally the next day my grandma passed away, and like my closest grandma. And so I was just like, whew, that's part of like the death worker in a way, right? And I think in the long run I would want to get into those topics more, but like for now I'm just chilling.
You say you're just chilling after that. Okay, but super believable. I love that. I want you to talk about that more. I stan.
Yeah.
I guess this might be I wasn't sure if I was going to mention this or not, but this
Mm.
might be a good time to mention it. One of the reasons that I love Mars and Cancer so much is because my dad had Mars and Cancer.
Oh.
And he passed about 5 years ago. And he was so very Mars and Cancer that it was wild. And I'm also a Sag rising. And so like his Mars is in my 8th house of,
Mm.
inheritances. And
Yeah.
he definitely left me some baggage,
Yeah, yeah.
as it happens, because he passed very, very suddenly. And so that happens oftentimes, especially in the eighth house, where you just get left things that you must deal with.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and especially for you, like being Mars in Cancer, having it so vivid, and
Yeah,
have it happen, then have it almost like strike you in that way, like in a dream, so prophetic and so deeply moving, that
yeah.
it was, yeah, undeniable.
Yeah, and I think it's also like, like talking about like family and stuff. So while it's kind of just like the Mars is like Marsing, it's I grew up like I think one of my origin like I tell people about this sometimes when I was doing my healing work as a person. One of my original wound is actually when I was I think at like Mars is like the bully, right? And sometimes it can be the bully in the chart. One of my like OG, if I call it like such an one of the OG wounds in my life, or I would like to say like where I experienced some sort of like fuck this shit, right? That's like how I call like an OG wound. It's when I was like younger, and it's not actually death, and I think it was experiencing like domination by others, and it was mainly through my brother, which is kind of interesting, like because my Mars is in the term lord of Mercury, and Mercury sometimes signify brothers, like people who are peers. And I have an older brother. He's autistic. He has autism, kind of severe in the sense of like we can communicate, but like it's not like everything he would understand. It's very much like a non-verbal sort of like intimacy of language. And I think earlier on in my life, I had a moment where I had to go to school with him together. And then people making fun of him because, people making fun of him because he's autistic, right? And then people asked him to do things, and I remember being so mad, like, and I like at that age, it's just like I think it's like, obviously like you wouldn't want to murder someone, but then that's also like how the extreme of like how violent like a Mars can be, to be honest. It's like I want to take someone's life, and I think that's like that is I think one of like the Mars in Cancer sort of like wounding in a way that's just like you feel that scar very like deeply, right? To the point where you feel that if you react to that scar alone, it will it will be damaging. um and I think that's kind of like important thing to talk about, like a fallen type placement, because if it's like exalted, like for example exalted placement like Capricorn, for example, they have that sort of strategy, right? They know the strategy to get back to another person, like. But then Mars in Cancer is like sometimes it is a Mars with kind of like no strategy in some ways too. It's like emotional strategy, yes, perhaps sometimes. And but then at that age you don't really have like emotional strategy, like you're still forming your emotions in a way. And so I think that is like one of my earliest sort of like remembering of like when did I feel deeply my Mars in Cancer was feeling suppressed in a way, was like fighting my like I've like fought for my brother's bully as well. And then I remember it was like the outcomes was like I was ended up being shamed for it. And I was like, what the fuck? I am protecting my brother and I am the one who's wrong. And I'm just like, this shit has to go, And so yeah, and I do feel like perhaps Mars, like I don't know whether it's like me personally, but then I do feel that Mars and Cancer people might have some sort of like experience of like strife with others, or with early in their life with either other people, or maybe fighting for someone else. And but then they are ending up being shamed by it, right? They are the ones like ending up like the fallen sort of experience, right? You're like, oh, like that shit happened to you, but like when I take responsibility of it, when I'm reacting to someone else shit, I am the victim, right? I am like the victim and the perpetrator in like the oppressed and the oppressor at the same time. And I was like, what the fuck? Yeah. So that's one of like very real example of like my Mars in Cancer, I feel.
Yeah, that's such a deep wound to carry. That is something that's really striking me and always has about Mars and Cancer, is the way that they carry wounds, and the way that
Mm-hmm.
you remember them, and the way that those literal scars
Mm-hmm.
then really shape how you act from there. Like they shape your actions that you take from there. Also, I thought it was very potent that you literally acknowledge that like very martial desire at times when Mars is like, I could just take your head off, because
Yeah, like that's
that is
literally the imagery of Mars in a lot of like medieval, or whatever imagery, imagination. It's like, yeah, like the Mars will like Mars is like will cut your head,
100%.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that very martial energy, has to have a healthy way to get out
Mm-hmm.
before it does cut someone's head off and explodes or implodes or
Yeah.
just erupts in a way that can't be contained because it hasn't had a healthy avenue
Mm-hmm.
to exert what it needs to
Yeah.
feel like it's okay. And
Yeah.
when a planet, especially fallen planet, you have to really be more sensitive to knowing what it's going to take to get calmed down, to be right, to be able
Yeah.
to find a good homeostasis. That's like one of my favorite words with the moon in general, but like especially moon
Mm-hmm.
ruled planets is like the constant need to find homeostasis. And
Yeah.
with Mars, it's like the homeostasis within those urges, within that anger, within those quick
Yeah.
reactions,
Yeah.
and all of the ways that that's like really shaped your life. And especially like having a brother, like having someone that you literally care for, someone
Yeah.
that you physically have to care for, that you are also then simultaneously protecting.
Yeah. Yeah. And no, yeah, that's very Mars and Cancer for me. Like, and I remember that feeling and from very young. It's wild. Yeah. And like it's so funny because it's like I always like, and I think it's also like, it's also a very hidden Mars, right? And so like if I go to my day to day like life, like eighth house and like like dark houses has a way of like not to say like you don't see it, like, but then it's more so that's like it takes like you don't show it to people usually, right? It's like your hidden. It can also be your hidden weapon in some ways as well. Like because like sometimes people feel like there are instances in life where people think that like are to be fucked with or like people betray you or whatever, and you're just like like you're just like, oh, you don't know me. And that's
That
like I think
is
I love that part of the Dead Dark Houses. Like you don't know me.
truly, you don't know me. You really don't.
Yeah,
That's a
because it's
that
like from the
is
perspective of like the second, like I think that's like 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 from the perspective of like the seventh, they also cannot see like the eighth, right? And so it's a lot about like the perspective. Yeah.
yeah, that's a very dark house experience of you think you know me. You think you know me, but you don't.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you don't. You
But
don't.
yeah.
I'll let you get in a little closer and then you'll know a little bit more, but you're still not going to know everything.
Yeah, I think that's a very dark house sort of like any planets kind of like experience, yeah.
And
Especially
especially,
Malefic, yeah.
yeah. And especially for Mars and Cancer, that being such a defense mechanism and that
Yeah,
being such like the thing that keeps you safe and protects you,
yeah.
and all of the ways, what you were saying about your brother and like about that feeling really got to me. The what you were saying about bullying specifically and
Mm-hmm.
that need to like be better than another in a way that
Yeah.
feels so much more sensitive for Mars and Cancer. Kind of what you were saying earlier about like the level of pettiness
Yeah.
that can be incorporated into it and how that really can set off your emotions, because it's
Mm-hmm.
very hard. It's very hard to stay emotionally calm when you're in a very heated situation.
Yeah. Yeah. That's like a natural bodily response too, right? Like the fight and flight or whatever the triggers, etc. So yeah, that's very true.
Definitely. Like it's hard to stay calm. It's hard to, it's hard to listen to your emotions when your
Mm-hmm.
nervous system gets triggered in that way. Your
Yeah.
body gets hot. It's harder to logic,
Yeah.
and it's very, you have to really prioritize your emotions and knowing and being in tune with them, which, something also worth mentioning is, Mars is a nocturnal planet, and being ruled
Mm-hmm.
by the moon, it's still being ruled by a planet in its own sect. And so there
Yeah.
is still an embodied wisdom that comes that shouldn't be forgotten or looked
Yeah.
over.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And like I do feel though, like I like sometimes I'm always so glad if I'm being born at night, to be honest, because it's like, all right, Mars is like kind of like my segment, right? And I think it's like, and I do have, I think the part of the experience of Mars is also like in Cancer, like, you know, like the eighth house can also be about other people's money. And I've been on like scholarships throughout my life, and it's also very like Mars in the bounds of Mercury in the eighth house, I guess. It's like, oh yeah, like I've, you know, I think because of like my achievement intellectually, etc. It's like, oh, I get on like kind of like a scholarship sort of like experience of other people's things. And yeah, like that felt very embodied for me to kind of like experience the Mars quite literally as well in my life. Yeah.
Yeah, because that's a super literal. That's what we call the astrologer good.
The astrologer good. And the one I want to talk about actually was like, if I were a day chart, I don't know if I can control that Mars, you know? That's the if there's any day chart Mars and Cancer out there, I don't know how you're dealing with life, but I hope you do it in the bestest way. But yeah, it's like, because it's like I do have, because sometimes I, not to say I romanticize, but like, you know, because sometimes I always look at my chart in a like a sec lens, right? And then I'm like, my diurnal planets are pretty on point, right? You know, they're very good. They're very like exalted, domicile. Jupiter has triplicity, you know, and so sometimes I like, but on my night planets, my benefic is like, benefic is Venus in Aries, and then my malefic is Mars in Cancer. So that's why I always ask, like, I always love to ask people who especially all the traditional astrologers who kind of like love essential dignities, or like um who like, I will always ask them like, how would you evaluate my malefics and etc. And usually it'll be like, it's kind of confusing because I do feel like Saturn will definitely grant great things, and then Mars will also fuck shits up but also give you good things as well. And so it's very mixed bag for me, I think, my chart. Yeah.
Yeah, we've talked about this. You know that I am for sure a sect above everything else person.
Yes, you are.
There is no dignity better than sect for a
Yeah.
planet in my perspective. And
Yeah.
also just my embodied experience of that. But that is part of the Mars experience that I have come to, especially in my body, come to very much realize also. You know, my Mars is also debilitated, also ruled by like a planet in its sect. You know, mine's ruled by Venus.
Mm-hmm.
And that embodied knowingness
Mm-hmm.
that you are going to be able to survive or get through anything
Mm-hmm.
is something that really cannot be overstated,
Yeah.
because when Mars doesn't have what it wants to have, when it's not surrounded with the energy that it likes, you know, when it has to find resources among things that it really wouldn't want, anything helps.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something very primal with the
Yeah.
way that Mars operates.
Yeah.
And when it's in its own sect, you know, like you have a night chart. And so when it's able to have a little more leeway
Mm-hmm.
in the way that it moves, there's a deeper knowing that is different than a diurnal knowing.
Yeah.
And because Mars does not deal with diurnal knowing at all.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah, my
not
Mars. Yeah.
that is not in the Mars wheelhouse, especially a Mars in Cancer.
Yeah.
And so it's almost a sense of being honest about what about what Mars really needs and about what it will take to get that.
Yeah. No, I love that point because I remember someone tweeted recently at, who was it? Um about like the quoting Demetra George. Oh, I think it's like Psychic Nuna, like Chloe. Uh, Quoting Demetra George saying like, yeah, like night charts, like, you know, process things through like the caverns of their bodies, right? Like to the deep. Like for me, it's like, yeah, it's like that's like very nocturnal. Like, yeah, like night chart always has this some sort of like internal sort of like processing of life that they always kind of like do. And it feels natural to them, you know.
Absolutely, it does. It's just and it's actually, I've realized this as a very nocturnal person. I've realized that it's something that when I'm not aware of it, I am doing it on autopilot.
Mm.
And that I get into this point of, especially being very Mars myself, I just get into a state of very comfortable doing.
Mm.
And my Mars knows that it can just work on autopilot, and it can just do and do and do and do, and there's not really a need to think about what I'm doing, because my body already knows. My body already knows the patterns and the movements, and that very primal martial urge to just keep going, to keep doing, is so strong and powerful. And it is just it's a very nocturnal force. It is, which I do feel, this is a soapbox for now or any day of the week, I just feel like people have fucking Mars problems. Like I feel like our world has spent a lot of time working on our diurnal consciousness. We're really doing great on that. I mean, maybe we could do better, but we could always do better, I think. But there's been such a lack of this embodied nocturnal consciousness, essentially this Venus Mars crisis that I feel like a lot of people and society as a whole is having to really reckon with and figure out how to exist as an embodied person when our world is so diurnal and is so outside of the body that in a lot of ways I feel like Mars, and even Mars in Cancer specifically, speaks to that primal need to get back into the body, and how literally almost how we can die Mars without being a body, the moon.
Wow, I love that. No, I feel that very strongly, and I think it's like, somehow now it kind of like reminds me of like the Mars kind of like, I think I lost my thoughts, but like I think it's just like, like, the idea, like the Tema Mundi, right? It's like the Cancer rising sign. I was like thinking about like Mars, like what would like the Mars in Cancer in the Tema Mundi would feel, and the kind of just like, oh, that's like the primal body of like the primal body of like the Matrix, Cancer, or like the universe, etc. So I just had that passing thought.
Crazy enough, I just had a client actually who I had to rectify their chart, and they have Mars and Cancer in the first. And I was thinking about this because I knew we were about to record this. And this was just like a week ago. And when I was rectifying the chart in my head, I actually thought, I was like, it would just be a little too weird if it ended up being a Cancer rising chart. It would just be a little too on the nose.
Oh my God.
And that's then wild. Just through the timing techniques and talking to them and just everything, it was like, you're a Cancer rising. Yeah. And that is a whole other thing that I've thought a lot about is, the difference between the Thema Mundi and then the, I guess, like Aries rising, I guess what people call like ABC type method, and the differences of that. And how you mentioned specifically thinking about the Thema Mundi, like Mars, if Mars was in Cancer, in the Thema Mundi chart, and how that would really feel, and how potent that would be in the body as well.
I think you got cut off just now. Is that because of my internet? Sorry.
Oh, we'll keep rocking.
Okay. All right.
We'll keep rocking.
Yeah.
Essentially was just speaking about, kind of riffing on what you said about the Thema Mundi, and like if Mars had been in Cancer for it. That's actually a great time to ask if you have anything to share about Mars in your body. I want to, at this point, I always want to mention this when we talk about this, because all the traditional planets have a house in the chart where they have their joy, and Mars rejoices in the 6th house, which the 6th house, it is the house where you maintain your body. Literally, it is all the stuff you have to do to human, like the verb. Not always super thumbs up for everybody. But do you have anything to share about your experience with Mars in relation to your body, or the way that it comes out, or the way that it feels for you? Anything like that?
I do feel though, like, because my Mars is it's attached to the moon, right? And so I do feel that like some sort of like, I do feel water sort of healing actually really remediates my Mars almost. And like, like loving swimming, I used to be like, it's so funny, I used to fear, like, I mean people do have fear of open waters and stuff. I think that's natural, but like I do have it more, I guess, in some way, because it's like, I'm so scared. But like I remember I was even scared of like the deep waters one time, but I love to swim, so it's kind of funny. um and so that's kind of like one thing. I don't like the beach though, so that's also like interesting. I only love the beach whenever I go with my friends. So when I was meeting you, I was only there because my friends were there, right? It's like, it's one of those things where like I only love the beach when it's with my friends. And that's kind of I do think as a Mars and Cancer person, like obviously I think like I think taking showers are always just like very healing for my emotions. Like every single time, everything I have a bad day, whatever, like literally I just get in the shower or a bath, like it will almost like I'm a new person, and so it helps to regulate those things for sure. um I do feel,
Wow, a
yeah,
rebirth.
a rebirth. Like
A
it is
rebirth.
very very obvious thing. I do feel like Mars and water sign people, um because water is related to a lot of intuition, and like, especially Cancer, because Cancer, like I think a lot of water placement tends to kind of like absorb things, and sometimes you don't know what you're absorbing, right? I mean, I guess Mars and Scorpio has that discernment, I guess, like what gets into the water. But then I do feel like Mars in Cancer, or like even Mars in Pisces, people have that sense of like porousness to their kind of like, and I do feel like doing I do lots of like spiritual sort of like cleansing in a way, and that's also like really is helpful for my own energetic sort of like residual or baggage in a way. And maybe it's also just because that Mars is also in the eighth, so it's like you don't want to be taking up other people's fight, or like other people's sort of like problems, right? And so that's kind of like the embodiment way. Obviously, my fifth house ruled by Mars, also like I'm quite active in terms of like dancing and stuff like that, and that's like the solar Venus effect as well. But I do feel that like there's also like a very releasing quality to those things as well. But yeah, I think swimming is like it's a Mars and Cancer thing apparently. Or like being in the water, just like, you know.
Yeah, the literal cleansing and
Yeah.
feeling, and the way that that can really bring you back to your emotions and
Hmm.
bring yourself back to homeostasis in a way,
Yeah.
literally.
Yeah. No, that's very true. Yeah. And I cannot go a day without like showering. I cannot. Like if I miss the day, like sometimes I'm like, oh, like I'm feeling I didn't go out today. But even then I'll be like, the next day I'll like the first thing that I do, I'll shower, kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Interestingly, I have been so thirsty this entire time. If you're watching the video version, you've seen me probably take about 20 sips of water because this always happens with Mars, because I do physically get very hot when I talk about Mars, when I invoke Mars, when I work with Mars, because I also, being very Mars, I run very hot. And
Mm.
so I am constantly drinking water to cool myself down, to hydrate, also because I only have one water planet, and like
Hmm.
they're not happy about it.
Yeah.
And so I'm constantly drinking water. And so I've literally had almost like at least 2/3 of my water bottle that I've had already.
Wow.
Which I thought was so interesting, because I'm always pretty thirsty, especially like talking a lot and running hot.
Hmm.
But specifically, I thought it was interesting, just every single time we talk or say anything, it's like that Mars and Cancer energy that's just in the air palpably is like, hey, hydrate.
Yeah.
Make sure that your body's okay.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. Like I do need, like I sweat a lot too. Like I think, I don't know if that's a Mars and Cancer thing, but like yeah, it's like I drink a lot of water. But then yeah, that's another thing. Like my chart is funny because it's like my Aries Sun and Venus can be like non-water. Like I don't want to drink water, but like, the moon would be like, hey, you need that for a source of energy. And yeah, and sometimes you gotta like learn it the hard way, right? It's like, oh, I do need water, because like Mars is kind of like the survival sort of like planets, right? And so I do feel like sometimes Mars is like, oh, I'm fine with like lacking water, or like blah blah blah. But then yeah, like that's not the best for you. Obviously, not the best for the body.
Interestingly, it's not good for survival, actually, because it's
Yeah.
interesting how you said it, how Mars is the survival planet, yet
Yeah.
something as simple as continually drinking water can be like, I don't want to do that. I don't need to do that. I'm going to be fine.
Yeah, which is kind of interesting. Yeah, that's so true. Which like people like, hydration is you can die from hydration. That's the first thing, right? So yeah, that's very true and very fair. Yeah.
Wow, that's wild. I don't know. Maybe those aren't, because you were like, I don't know if sweating a lot is a Mars and Cancer thing. And I'm thinking, I've kind of think that it is, actually. I think so. I can't remember. I wish I can remember this right now. I feel like there's a maybe celebrity or somebody who has Mars and Cancer who is like known for sweating, and I cannot remember who it is right now.
Yeah, I
But
was just like, I know,
I think
I
that's a
just like,
thing.
I don't know whether that's a thing or not, but like, yeah, that just crosses my mind,
I'm gonna
Yeah.
go ahead and confidently say that it's a thing. I'm actually just gonna go ahead and say that.
Yeah.
Because Mars himself does do like sweating, hot things like that. Mars
Mhm.
is the planet that inflames us. If we have inflammation like that in the body, it's Mars.
Mhm.
Interestingly, I am actually having all of these things are so on point that I'm actually having kind of a rather severe allergic reaction. And so many like parts of my body are like kind of swollen right now with
Mhm.
just like this allergic reaction.
Yeah.
So it's literally inflammation. And it's also worth mentioning that right now, as we're recording, Mars is functionally edging.
It is at that point.
Mars right now is at 29 degrees and 43 minutes of Gemini.
Oh my God. Yeah, it's gonna dip this weekend.
It's gonna dip, yeah, because tomorrow
Yeah.
morning, pretty early. Because Shahir and I are recording this right as Mars is about to move into Cancer. Because I really wanted to record on a Friday, because Friday nights are Mars night.
Yeah, and I have my background is like the Mars. I think the Zoom background is actually Mars. I chose an online photo of it. Yeah.
I love it. I wanted to mention that earlier, but I didn't want to guess. But I was like, I really think that looks like Mars.
That
looks like
is
Mars.
the Martian terrain. Yeah, it is. It is. And I was like, and I think I was thinking about like Mars was also like, yeah, the agitation you're talking like, because Mars is about like the allergic or like the inflammation and the agitation. And I was like thinking that through the lens of Cancer, and I was like, yeah, like Cancer, like like I think this is funny thing, but like Mars and Cancer, I do feel they can feel agitated by their emotions, and that is as simple as that. It's just like, oh, why am I feeling this? And like I don't like this, I don't like this feeling, is a very typical Mars and Cancer. And I think it's actually good to not bottle it up, right? Because sometimes Cancerian has a way of like trying to bottle it up, and then I do feel like learning from my experience of it, I just like, yeah, just express it and use like certain moments to kind of just like be very direct and non like non very just simply confrontation. It doesn't mean like that's also the thing. Okay, sometimes I think this is the bad. I think Marsica sometimes takes things too emotionally. And to the point of like, it's just simple. It's just like you're annoyed by that. That's fine, and that's okay. I'm just like, oh yeah, right. I'm a bit annoyed by that. And like you can just tell someone, right? I'm like, but then like I think for Mars and Cancer to say that, like, because I guess it's like for them it's like so agitating and so heavy, but then for other people it might just be like, all right, they're like, we're not gonna do that. Like, it's like it's actually an easy thing. And so sometimes I do feel Mars and Cancer can like over. It's like it can be like a very dramatic Mars.
Dramatic Mars. That's hilarious because Mars honestly is pretty dramatic as a planet as a whole.
Yeah.
And that definitely can definitely add the drama, because it's funny that you say that, because that is I have recognized that in like friends, people that I love, as a person who just loves debilitated Mars. I collect y'all, and they do get very agitated when they are emotional, and like not just emotional, but feeling emotions that they didn't prepare themselves for.
Yeah.
That's what it really is. Because if you prepare yourself for emotion, you're like, all right, I have fortified myself.
Yeah.
I am ready for it. I'm ready to receive it. I feel strong, like you have that martial defense.
Yeah.
Whereas when you feel this onslaught of unexpected emotions or new emotions, or just really something that you weren't prepared for, it can be this just frustration about having to deal with it.
Yeah, no, and it also reminds me of like the crab, right? It's like if you're agitated, the crab, like it's like trying to like go away, like I don't want to, like I just like I'm trying to I don't like, but then the crab also has to move, that's like the cardinal. I think that's why I think like Mars and Pisces can be a bit like, oh, like they're fine with it, right? Because they can just like avoid it. But I don't think Mars and Cancer could like avoid it necessarily, because it's like I need to be moved somewhere with this. If not, I feel stagnant. It's like it's still like it's like cardinal water, like a waterfall in the river, etc. So it's like it has that sort of like force to go somewhere. And so that's why they end up like feeling agitated in their own body. You're just like, oh, expect that, like, when in fact it can just be like, calm down. Although sometimes you shouldn't tell Mars and Cancer to calm down, because they'll be like,
1,000,000% do not tell them to calm down. That is not the beta. That is not it. Do not tell Mars and Cancer to calm down. If you want them to calm down, you're just gonna just let them calm down.
Let them create the space for themselves, Yeah.
I guess this is a good time to ask, because this is relevant, if you have advice or words of wisdom for people with this Mars placement, or for people who love someone with this placement.
I think it's like, I do feel that Mars and Cancer, like, okay, for people with this placement, I would say that, fight for the things you love. And I think that's part of the beauty of Mars and Cancer. There's an ease of like finding, not find, like, I think the more the things like the more you fight for the things you love and the things you care for, and I think it's like it makes you some sort of like your own champion in that way. And I think there's a sort of like ease into tuning into your feelings of why you love it as well. And I mean, that's a good part. I think if it's like more difficult part of like sense of like emotions, etc., I do feel that it's, anger is also part of the emotion, and agitation is also part of like, being in a body, and there's no shame in that. And I think there is some sort of like Mars and Cancer can sometimes experience some sort of like shame with regards to certain sort of like difficult emotions. And I think just do something with it too, like any sort of like activities that can portray that, like make art, dance, whatever, write it out. And so I do feel like Mars needs that sort of like expression, and so the water got to move somewhere. And so I do feel like creating containers for it.
I want to add something.
Yeah, go ahead.
Something that I have seen about people who have Mars and Cancer. I saw this first in my dad, and then I recognized it in other people that have Mars and Cancer. Mars is the planet of sport. We know this. People with Mars and Cancer, for them, caring about people is a sport. They care about people so hard that for them it is like an activity.
Yeah.
And I've seen it in a lot of like some of the ways that like different people interact with each other, like how different people's Mars work together. That sometimes people are like not used to that. And so they think that like, oh, maybe they consider that overbearing.
Yeah.
Or they consider that maybe even like would say, oh, you care too much.
Yeah.
As opposed to recognizing the type of care that is and how sacred that really is.
Oh yeah, oh my god, I don't even realize that. And I that's kind of funny, like that's very true. That's very true. And I think it's like, for people that loves people with Mars and Cancer, and I do think it's like, this is my either final message for Mars and Cancer people, I guess. It's also like, emotion is not like a threat, and then I think Mars and Cancer can sometimes either like they might feel okay if other people's showing their emotions, but they might not feel okay when they themselves want to feel those emotions, right? And then it's like that's where the complex also comes in, because you feel that you need to be better in some way, but like you don't have to. You're also human, right? And so I think it's like people who are you care for also deserves your like vulnerability as much as they deserve your advocacy in terms of like how you're being their fierce protector, right? Because it's like, oh, there's like a macho-ness, right? Like the kind of like problematic masculinity aspect of Mars that wants that the pride actually too with Mars that wants to be like I'm the warrior, but then I'm also hurting, I'm like, and so I think reckoning is that how that sort of vulnerability is also power to yourself. Yeah.
I love that. The vulnerability is your power. That
Yeah.
is so good.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I just realized I skipped over talking about any like people or that have Mars in Cancer that we maybe wanted to like talk about or like mention. Do you want to do that?
Yeah, we can do that. One of my favorite Mars and Cancer people was actually one of my favorite writers, actually, was Neil Gaiman. Yes, he has Mars and Cancer. I'm obsessed with Neil Gaiman, and it's kind of funny how I have collections of like Neil Gaiman's books. The Sandman series, people know that too. I don't have the Sandman series because it's so expensive. When I was growing up, and I don't have access to it, but I was like, what, like I was reading them online. Um, and yeah, like he's a fantasy book writer. I mean, some people would know him. And he actually has his Mars like very close to mine. I think he's like 16 degrees or something. And I was like, oh, no wonder. And I mean, he's a Scorpio, so it's like, and so I don't know what his like sun rising is, but yeah, I think Neil Gaiman is one. Um, I know Malcolm X is also a Mars in Cancer, and that's so interesting. Like
That's so interesting.
how people kind of like portray him as like, like the more quote unquote violent one, which actually no, like there's a lot of like history in terms of like Black history talking about and that's also part of Mars and Cancer, right? Because it's really about the protecting of like my people in a way, right? And like they're such a because Cancer is kind of like a tribal sort of like sign in some ways. And so that's part of like the Mars and Cancer of like the fierce protector of their own people, quote unquote. And how you define that people is also up to you. You were pointing out some people as well.
But also like how you define what kinds of protection should be allowed and like what should be permitted and what someone should be allowed to care about, and like essentially policing the way that somebody cares.
Yeah, no, for real. Yeah, no. I think that's part of the forceful nature and on the Mars, and like also like the experience of like obviously the oppression during those times as well, like during the civil rights movement.
Right. Especially because now, how you mentioned like the perception that now has been put on it, because now people remember Malcolm X and literally call him, just like you said, the more violent, compared to Martin Luther King being dubbed like, the peaceful one, essentially. And
which is a lie, which is like they actually share a lots of like similar kind of like framing and philosophical thinking too. Yeah. But yeah,
right.
I like the portrayal of it. Yeah.
Right. Their portrayal, and essentially how like the way that they tried to care for their own was seen as, incorrect.
Yeah.
Which is such a fallen experience.
It is a fallen experience.
You're like, I'm literally just trying to survive out here, and you're telling me that the only way that I am able to survive is wrong. So what the fuck else am I supposed to do?
Yeah, for reals. Yeah. Yeah.
Someone else I think we both kind of wanted to mention was Miley Cyrus.
Oh yeah. Miley Cyrus.
We love.
She has lots of like Scorpio and Sag, right? And then Mars and Cancer, I guess.
And I love her, Mars and Cancer. I love the way that has, because something that we kind of didn't mention that either if we would have mentioned earlier, I wanted to mention with her was this sort of this almost need to fight for intimacy, in terms of once you have achieved a certain level of vulnerability with someone or with something, doing anything that you can to fight for it and maintain it, which is like very evident in her extremely long relationship with her now ex, he who shall not be named.
Yeah.
And if you know, you know. Yeah. And she deserves better. And but she fought for that relationship. Like she did, like they broke up, they got back together, like she fought for it. And one of the things that I read, something that she said was that their home had like a big fire in it a few years ago. And she said that essentially that like crisis like kept them together, and like they got closer because they were each other's survival partners, literally. And when I read that, I was like, this is so Mars in Cancer. It's ridiculous because it's like that desire to hold on to the only sense of comfort that you have for like, it's the only thing that you have. So you will hold on to it for dear life, even if it ends up being a thing that is hurting you.
Yeah, no, for real. It's like, because like the clenching part of Cancer, right? I mean, that's like, I didn't tell a lot of people, but like, yeah, like, I mean, obviously with all water signs, especially Cancer, it's like, there's no such thing as moving on. Ouch. But like, but then, yeah, like the clenching of like the Cancer, right? It's like once you give it something, or like the crab. But yeah, like it is about like holding on to that thing, and you just like, and I was like, oh yeah, Miley is iconic. I remember like, and it feels like, yeah, even like the wrecking ball like feels like very like Mars and Cancer, like that like kind of like a showy part of it, right? It's kind of just like, it's like a show of power almost, right?
Literally, like
Yeah.
that moment and like that music video was so iconic because other people had done it, but she just did it in her Miley way, which was coming through and literally being like, let me use my force and let me show you my power because I am so vulnerable. Like I am gonna literally like sob on screen, just sing and sob, and then hop my ass on a literal wrecking ball to come through and wreck some shit. It's literally like, I will use my emotions as power, which is so amazing, and it's such a beautiful embodiment of this placement.
Yeah, for real. Yeah, and I think I think I remember Miley has a Scorpio moon that's also like helps, like she has that like mutual receptivity going on.
Someone else I think we wanted to mention was Lana Del Rey. She is honestly such a Cancer queen that I like. She is one of the most iconic Cancers I think ever. Like Summertime Sadness. I mean, come on.
Yeah, I mean, like I think even the recent one, what the ANW one, right? American Horror, like to call like herself that in a way, like that felt very Cancer. I mean, I know like that felt very Mars and Cancer too. It's just like her sign is also in Cancer, and so like to call yourself something like that, like that's so provocative in some ways too. Yeah.
Yeah, that's something that like all of her music has such a deep emotional sense to it. Like you put on her music and it's like you're transported somewhere. It's like this almost like sense of nostalgia. And I do think that almost like similar to Miley's like wrecking ball moment, I feel like Lana Del Rey's kind of like entire work of like past and like in music has really shown the power of emotions in the way that like so many different emotions she has portrayed in her music, and she does them with such confidence that they become this extremely potent medicine.
And I think, is Lana Scorpio rising? I'm not too sure, but I know that I think the Mars is kind of like important as well somehow.
For sure. I think I'm actually not sure about her rising sign, but yeah. Anybody else that you want to mention? Anything else about Mars and Cancer you want to mention?
I think I remember one of the greatest like horror writers, also like Stephen King, has Mars and Cancer. And then that's like how like Stephen King is like a lot of like horror fantasy person. And I think he has a Cancer rising and Mars and Cancer. And so so it's like tapping on the power of like horror, like fear. Like Mars is that like I'm fucking scared. Like some people like like that some of like the movies that derive from his books are like scary.
Yeah, not just scary, but like suspenseful as well. This is something that I've learned with myself as a Mars person, that I personally hate suspense.
I didn't know that.
I hate suspense. I hate like the impending fear, or literally even, we don't even know if it's fear, like the impending something. Special shout out to all my loved ones who deal with me never wanting to go see any movie ever because I hate suspense.
I see.
Unless it's based on a book and I can read the book first. but that way, like, especially with Stephen King, like the way that you can really tap into the raw emotion of fear and of just that unsure, because when you feel fear, you are unsure if you're going to be okay.
Yeah.
And so there is something within you that is not sure what it's going to take for you to be okay.
Yeah.
And that is such a visceral Mars and Cancer experience.
That's it. That's a Mars and Cancer sort of like magic, or it is like, it's contagious that way. And kind of just like, it also is mysterious in that way too. It's just like, oh, like what's gonna, like, because cardinal is like, Mars is like, it's like kind of like, it's the penetrating sort of like thing, right? It's like, it's like the suspense. It's like, oh, where is this thing gonna move my emotion to it, right? And I think that's also part of thing that you're tapping into, of like, because there is a sense of like unknowing of like where would your emotions go through that horror, or through that sort of like suspense.
Yeah, like all of the pathways that like your emotions can go, and essentially a roller coaster that you're then taken on.
That's so true.
Wow, I love that. Okay, so I guess any final things that you want to say about Mars and Cancer, whether it be a person, whether it be your experience, whether it be anything about Mars being ruled by the moon that you wish to share?
I think that's all for now. And if anyone has anything more to add, feel free to join in the conversation in the comments, or whatever.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything right now that you are working on? So is there anything right now that you are really excited about? And what do you offer? Because of course, now that people have listened to this episode and they know you more, we want to let them know how to find you, how to reach you, how to get in touch with you. And also, of course, if there's anything specifically right now that has you really, really excited, because if there's one thing that we love about Mars, it's excitement. Okay. We can all agree that we love to be excited. So
for me, right now I've been doing lots of, this year I have like my birthday blend offerings, and that's basically like a birthday reading. I combine it with like oracle, meaning that I kind of like channel the planets towards the end and the beginning. That's an exciting offering, like, perfection, solar return, etc. It's kind of like all in one. That's one. I'm also recently, I just released a Love is Origin, like a Venus sort of like portal, just based on my Venus work. It came from my like, it's like a combo of like tarot and astrology reading, which what I do as well as a combination. But then this is one more like a thematic offering, I feel, where we delve into love and all the love related planets and lots and activation, because I used to be such a great I still am, obviously, but like I love doing love readings for some reason, and I think that's like the Venus rejoicing for me. I'm like, oh, love readings, I love doing that. And I seem to be very good at being honest with the certain parts of like love readings as well. And so no matter what level or relationships you're in, you're searching, you're kind of like trying to see what's up, or even if you're seeing someone and want to like know how to know yourself better, I would highly recommend that session. And then another thing, I have like always three things. My third thing is like I have a spirit session, which I've kind of like talked a bit about in this podcast, in this talk as well. It's called like Spirit House. That is where we talk with the unseen and explore the archetypes, see what's up. And that's also like that's like a very that is how like I think you can really interface with my Mercury Mars magic as well, I feel, right?
Love. Anybody who knows me at all knows that I highly recommend Shahir. Shahir is absolutely amazing. We've like had done readings for each other. I've had Shahir do my year ahead reading for the last 2 years at this point, and Shahir has yet to miss. Okay. Has yet to miss, baby. Okay. The Mars Mercury magic is strong with this one.
Thank you.
For sure. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you so much, and I'm so grateful that you have been here to help me start this segment. This is so special to me. Mars is so special to me, especially Mars debilitated is so special to me. And there is so much magic and so much love in this planet and in this placement specifically that I feel like can be overlooked so easily. And it means so much to me that you were here with me to like really dive deep on it and really go in. So thank you so much for being here. And thank you for being here. And thank you all for listening. Thank you for listening to us dive deep on Mars. And thank you for being funky. I will see all of you the next time that our fates weave together.